this is Robert from Reading Through History, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Now, of course, the Lewis and Clark Expedition was a result of the United States acquiring New Orleans and the rest of Louisiana from France. Now, the United States had had its eyes on New Orleans for quite some time. We kind of had this on-again, off-again relationship with Spain where sometimes they would let us use New Orleans port and other times they would not. And it just so happens that when President Thomas Jefferson sent Robert Livingston and James Madison over to discuss the possibility of buying New Orleans, they had permission. You can spend up to $10 million to buy New Orleans, just the city and the port. And when they get over there, it is of course in the possession at the time of Napoleon Bonaparte in France. Because when he was trying to enforce his continental system, he went over and basically took over Spain on his way to Portugal. And he put his brother in charge. And throughout the course of all this fighting, he was running up quite a debt. He needed money, and he realized he had no possibility of keeping control of what they called Louisiana. So he decides we'll get something for it if we sell it. So when Livingston and Madison get over there and they get started talking about the possibility of buying New Orleans, they realize the French are really interested in getting rid of the whole thing. And they wind up getting a really good deal for it, about $15 million for all of it, virtually a third of what is today the contiguous 48 states. And $15 million, that's like 3 cents an acre. It's like the best land deal in the history of the world. And I would love to have seen their face when, you know what, we'll just throw in all of it, we'll give it to you for $15 million. And they're like, holy cow. I would have loved to have been able to see the look on their face. And I'd really love to have seen the look on Thomas Jefferson's face when he comes, when they return, they're like, hey, Robert, how'd it go? And he's like, well, you know what, a funny thing happened in France. And then they dump that on him. Now, Jefferson was a forward-thinking guy, and he had been really looking forward to sending explorers out there anyway, even before we bought it. He wanted to make a claim to all of this land. And he had a guy in mind, a guy named Meriwether Lewis. Now, oddly enough, Meriwether Lewis was a secretary of Jefferson, and it's really hard to imagine this guy in an office pushing papers, taking notes, and keeping track of things for President Jefferson. Because this was a rugged, outdoorsy type guy. And of course, he had a friend in mind, William Clark. Now, William Clark, oddly enough, is the brother of the great Revolutionary War hero, George Rogers Clark, the guy who captured Vincennes not once but twice, really rugged guy. So William Clark, he gets his name in history books for this expedition. And they throw this thing together, about 45 guys in all, and a dog, because they just had to take, Clark's dog. He's got to go on the trip, can't leave Fido at home. And they had map makers, which is what Clark was really good at. They had doctors, they had blacksmiths, they had guys who could repair guns, they had guys who were experts at sign language, so they could communicate with all the Native American Indians they came into contact with. And of course they leave St. Louis, which at the time, now we got this big, beautiful arc, this gateway to the west. At the time, there were only 180 houses in St. Louis. And most of the people who lived there were French. And they must have thought, wow, this is kind of, they didn't think, hey, one day they're going to be talking about when the last vestige of this being a great French village and the dog's getting crazy in here again. So they leave, and this is in May of 1804. And by August, they've reached Council Bluffs, Iowa. They've traveled roughly 2,500 miles. They're going to stay the first winter with the Mandan Indian tribe. Now, the Mandan Indian tribe is kind of interesting because apparently it was some sort of a cultural thing with them that they were really friendly with their visitors. And it was customary for them to share everything with their visitors, including their wives. Now, some people on this journey, of course, thought this was a little weird and they passed on it, but apparently there was one guy who shared upward of 30 wives that winter, which is interesting. And another person that I should probably mention that was on this journey was a guy named Toby. Now, Toby is interesting because Toby was a slave. And he was Clark's slave, I believe. And he was the first African American to go, across the entire continent and travel to the Pacific going over land that we know of. But what was really interesting about him is he was the only black man that most of these Native Americans ever saw. And they were like just blown away by this guy, and they thought, well, he must have some kind of magical powers. You know, the type of thing where they're like, oh, we got a sick child, can he hold it? Because they thought, hey, maybe he can cure it, or whatever. It was highly unusual for them to see a black person. Most of them never saw one in their life. Most of them never saw one again after that. That was like a one-time deal. So they leave St. Louis, they go stay with the Mandan Indians, and of course it's near about this time they pick up another very famous person on this journey. Now I do want to say it's one of those things, history might look at this differently than what really happened, but apparently, I've always heard Sacagawea. And if you watch any History Channel documentaries, they say Sacagawea. I'm like, well, that's probably how her people would have pronounced it. That's probably what she would have called herself, was Sacagawea. It sounds much more Native American than Sacagawea. But she was married to a Frenchman who was out there. He was a trapper, he was an explorer, and they go part of the way with Lewis and Clark, helping them on this journey, guiding them. And there is an interesting story where one of their boats overturned, and they had these massive collections of journals, like over 10,000 pages of notes they had taken. They fall into the icy water, and she jumps in after it and retrieves it and saves it. Kind of an interesting story. But there was another Native American who probably should get more credit than he does. His name was Toby. Or at least that's what Lewis and Clark reported his name as being, Toby. I've always thought that doesn't sound like a very Native American name, Toby. Your name's Toby. That's what they said to him, apparently. And he just became Toby, because I can't really imagine his name was Toby. But he's the guy who gets them across the Rocky Mountains. He's the guy who gets them to the other side, and they may not have made it had it not been for Toby. So, November of 1805, they reach the Pacific Ocean. They see it for the first time. They're the first Americans to go overland and get out there and actually see the Pacific Ocean. They traveled 2,500 miles. And what would be really depressing about this is you get there and you see it and you're like, oh, that's cool, that's awesome, that's majestic. And then you realize your journey's not even halfway over. Because now you got to find another winter quarters. This time they stay with the Clatsop Indians, who apparently weren't nearly as friendly as the Mandan Indians, because there's no note of them like sharing wives or anything. And the winter was also very brutal there. It was really cold, and the men became fond of eating dogs. I don't think they ate Clark's dog or anything like that, but they did have to survive eating, dog meat and stuff like that, which doesn't sound too flattering. But then they got to come back, and of course on their way back they find all these new trails, they collect more specimens. But there is a really weird story that happens on the way back. Apparently Captain Lewis gets shot in the rear end, like right in the bum. Bow! And what sucks about this is the way they had to treat it. They would just take linseed or some other kind of stuff, soak it in there. They would stick the they'd fill the wound with a rag that had been soaked in these oils. So you walk around with a rag in your behind. And he got shot on a hunting expedition. He's wearing his black skin, and people thought he was a deer. Oh, look at that two-legged deer, let's shoot him in the rear. And that's kind of what happened. Very uncomfortable. I mean, you can imagine how uncomfortable the journey must have been after that. But they return with this big wealth of knowledge. They bring back just journals, just packed full of information. They reached the Pacific. They did find the course of the Missouri River. They found out the continent was far wider than we thought. We had purchased a lot more area than anyone could have imagined. they find all kinds of passages through the mountains that later will be used, whenever the people are rushing to California and Oregon. And just a wealth of information on all of these tribes that were out there. And I've never seen any, reference to them having much trouble. Of course, it was a very safe journey. Very few people were, severely, you do get shot in the rear, but hey, it's a story to tell. We're sitting here over 100 years later, 200 years later, talking about getting shot in the rear. So there are some interesting stories to come out of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Of course, that's the area we bought in the Louisiana Purchase. That's like double the size of the country. Today it's like roughly a third of the United States territory. So it is a very interesting story. And I just kind of wanted to share some of this stuff with you people out there. And, got any questions, comments, or anything like that. These guys were far better explorers than, say, Zebulon Pike, who goes out of his way to see this big mountain that we've now named after him, and it takes 2 weeks to get there, and he doesn't even climb it, and he winds up War of 1812 going and getting crushed by a boulder. Should be a really sorry way to die. But check out our Facebook page link below if you're interested in any of our products. We're also going to put our TPT store down there so you can check out some of our materials there. Thanks.